In the autumn of 1347, Margaret, a girl of 15, stood trembling in the doorway of a stone cottage, her heart pounding like a storm against a fragile shore. The air was thick with the damp scent of wool, mingled with the faint, sour odor of unwashed bodies, a constant reminder of the gritty world she inhabited. Her bare feet pressed against the brittle rushes strewn across the cold floor, each step cracking like a whispered warning, amplifying the dread that coiled in her chest. Candlelight flickered across the rough, hewn walls, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to mock her fear, dancing like specters in the dim light. Her new husband, Henrik, a man nearly twice her age, approached the marriage bed, his weathered face stern, his calloused hands a symbol of labor and authority. Chosen by her father for his modest wealth, 3 pigs and a half-baker of barley, Henrik was no romantic figure from a bard's tale, but a necessity, a contract sealed in flesh. Margaret's hands quivered as she clutched the coarse woolen shift her mother had sewn, a garment passed down through generations, heavy with tradition and expectation. Beyond the thin, weathered walls, the raucous laughter of Henrik's friends pierced the night, their voices slurred with ale, shouting crude jests as they clanged pots with wooden spoons, a relentless clamor that would not cease until they heard proof of the marriage's consummation. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps, her chest tight with a fear that felt alive, clawing at her insides. As Henrik's fingers reached for the leather cord at her throat, her mother's hushed warnings about wifely duties echoed in her mind, vague, ominous words that offered no shield against the raw, suffocating reality of this moment. In this smoky, cramped room, where the air reeked of wet wool and fear, Margaret stood on the precipice of a life she could not escape, her fate bound to the will of others. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, a girl caught in a world where love was a luxury she could not afford. This was no tender union, no tale of passion woven with soft glances and whispered promises. This was medieval intimacy, a realm where desire was shackled by superstition, religious fervor, and the brutal demands of survival. The marriage bed was no sanctuary but a battleground, where bodies became pawns in a game of power, faith, and honor. The church's iron grip clashed with ancient pagan rites, and every touch carried the weight of eternal salvation or damnation. For Margaret, this act was not about love, but about fulfilling a contract, proving her worth to a community that watched her every move. The air seemed to hum with the tension of these truths, as if the walls themselves whispered of the rules that bound her. Her fear was not just for the physical act, but for the loss of herself, her body no longer her own, but a vessel for family honor, divine judgment, and societal order. Each flicker of the candle seemed to pulse with her heartbeat, a reminder that this night would define her place in a world that cared little for her heart. The bedding ceremony unfolded with a grim, ritualistic fervor, stripping away any semblance of privacy or dignity. Wedding guests, their faces flushed with the heat of ale and mischief, escorted Margaret and Henrik to their chamber, their hands tugging at the couple's clothing with rough, practiced efficiency. Their body songs filled the air, each verse dripping with mockery that stung Margaret's cheeks with shame, her heart pounding like a drum of war. The guests stripped the couple, leaving them exposed and vulnerable, their bodies bared to the flickering torchlight that cast an unsteady glow across the room. Then the crowd retreated, but only to linger just beyond the door, their ears pressed to the weathered wood, waiting for the sounds that would mark the marriage as legally binding. For them, Margaret's cries, whether born of pain or submission, were proof of her virginity's sacrifice, the breaking of her hymen, a public spectacle to affirm the union's validity. Her fear was a tangible weight, a cold sweat prickling her skin, as she realized there was no escape from their scrutiny. The community, the church, and the ghosts of ancient customs all claimed a stake in this most intimate moment, transforming it into a ritual of survival. To fail here, to show no blood, could mean disgrace, rejection, or worse. Her life hung on the precarious thread of this night's outcome. The noise outside grew louder, the guests' shouts a cacophony of expectation, their voices a reminder that this was no private moment, but a public performance. Margaret's stomach churned as she stood in the center of the room, her body exposed to the chill air, her skin prickling with both cold and shame. Henrik's presence loomed, his silence heavier than words, his eyes fixed on her with a mix of duty and desire. The community's role was not merely ceremonial, but legal. Their presence ensured the marriage was consummated, the contract sealed with bodily fluids. The bedding ceremony was a tradition rooted in survival, where the act of union was less about love and more about proving legitimacy, ensuring lineage, and securing alliances. Margaret's fear was not just for the pain to come, but for the judgment that awaited her. The eyes and ears of the village poised to dissect her every sound. Her mother's warnings echoed again, tales of brides who faced humiliation or worse for failing to meet these expectations. The weight of tradition pressed down on her, each shout from outside a hammer blow to her fragile resolve. The church's shadow loomed over the marriage bed, its doctrines weaving a suffocating web of fear around every touch, every glance. Theologians like St. Jerome, centuries before, had declared that a man who loved his wife too passionately was no better than an adulterer, his ardor a sin that offended God. Thomas Aquinas, in his Summa Theologica around 1265, had etched rigid rules into the fabric of medieval life. Sex was permissible only on certain days, in specific seasons, and in one sanctified position, man above, woman below, face to face. Any deviation oral sex, intimacy during menstruation, pregnancy, or breastfeeding, was a mortal sin, a direct path to the fires of hell. Margaret had learned these rules from her mother, who had heard them from the village priest in the dim light of confession, his voice heavy with warnings of divine wrath. The calendar of her life was marked by these restrictions, leaving only a handful of days, perhaps 50 in a year, when she and Henrik could touch without risking their souls. Each night, as Henrik's hands reached for her, she faced a wrenching choice: submit to his desires and court divine judgment, or refuse and face his anger in a world where a husband's violence was not only permitted but expected. Her heart pounded with the terror of this dilemma, the weight of eternity pressing down on her young shoulders, each decision a gamble between earthly pain and divine retribution. The Church's influence was not abstract, but visceral, its presence felt in every sermon, every confession, every whispered prayer. Margaret's mother had taught her to count the days, to know when Lent or other holy seasons forbade intimacy, to understand that even within marriage, pleasure was a danger to be avoided. The village priest's words echoed in her mind, tales of souls damned for straying from the narrow path of righteousness. The fear of hell was as real as the cold stone beneath her feet, a constant companion in her thoughts. When Henrik reached for her on a forbidden Wednesday, her body tensed, her mind racing with the consequences of compliance versus defiance. The Church's rules were not just spiritual but social, enforced by a community that watched for signs of sin, ready to report deviance to the priest or the courts. Margaret's fear was a living thing, a knot in her stomach that tightened with every touch, every moment of intimacy, a potential step toward damnation. Medieval medicine added its own layer of strangeness to Margot's world, its teachings rooted in ancient Greek and Roman texts that viewed women as flawed versions of men. Scholars taught that the vagina was an inside-out penis, the ovaries internal testicles, ideas codified in university halls and preached as truth. Physicians like Constantine the African, writing in the 11th century, claimed women needed prolonged stimulation and multiple climaxes to conceive, a belief that twisted justice in horrifying ways. If a woman became pregnant after rape, courts often saw it as evidence of her consent, her pleasure proof of complicity. Margot's mother had whispered of the wandering womb, a bizarre notion that the uterus could roam the body, causing hysteria, madness, or even death. Treatments were as fantastical as the ailment: sweets, smelling herbs burned near the vagina to coax the womb back, or foul odors wafted under the nose to drive it down. These ideas filled Margot with dread, her body a mystery even to herself, its functions governed by men who saw her as defective. Her fear was not just of the unknown, but of the consequences of these beliefs, which shaped how her community viewed her worth and her desires. The medical texts of the time were not mere curiosities, but had profound impacts on women's lives. Margot's mother had taught her to fear her own body, to see its natural processes as dangerous or shameful. The notion that her womb could wander, strangling her heart or escaping her body, was a nightmare that haunted her dreams. Physicians' treatments, fumigations, bloodletting, purges, were as likely to harm as to help, their ignorance cloaked in scholarly authority. Margot's heart sank at the thought of seeking help from such men, their hands probing her body with cold detachment, their remedies more terrifying than the ailments they claimed to cure. The village women whispered of these practices in secret, sharing stories of pain and survival, their knowledge a fragile shield against a world that sought to control their bodies. Margot's fear was a constant companion, her body a battleground where superstition and science collided, leaving her vulnerable to both. In the shadows of the village, pagan traditions lingered, defying the church's efforts to erase them. Wise women, branded as witches by later generations, preserved a secret knowledge of herbs and rituals, passed down through whispers in the dark. Under the full moon, women like Margot's mother gathered pennyroyal and tansy, brewing teas that could prevent pregnancy, though a misstep in dosage could mean death. Mandrake roots, carved into human shapes, were worn as fertility amulets, their value so great that counterfeit versions flooded markets. These practices, condemned as witchcraft, were a lifeline for women like Margot, who faced the constant threat of childbirth's deadly toll. 1 in 3 women perished in labor, their bodies broken by a world without reliable medicine. For unmarried women, pregnancy spelled ruin, their reputations shattered, their lives at risk. The wedding night's bloodied sheets, displayed to the crowd, were not just proof of virginity, but a shield against accusations of fraud or impurity. Margot's heart sank at the thought of failing this test, knowing some brides resorted to pricking their fingers or hiding animal blood to deceive the watchers. The forest gatherings were a rebellion, a quiet defiance against the church's control. Margot's mother had taken her once, under the cloak of night, to a clearing where women shared their secrets. The air was thick with the scent of herbs and the soft glow of moonlight, their voices low to avoid detection. These rituals were not just practical but spiritual, a connection to a past the church sought to bury. The women's faces were etched with determination, their hands steady as they prepared teas, or carved amulets, their knowledge a fragile thread of power in a world that sought to strip it away. Margaret's fear was tempered by awe, her heart stirred by the strength of these women, even as she knew the risks they face, the accusations of witchcraft, trials, and death. The Church's condemnation was a constant threat, but the need to control their bodies to survive drove them to these secret acts. The wedding night was not just about consummation, but about public verification, a ritual that stripped Margaret of dignity and laid her bare to the village's judgment. The bloodied sheets, proof of her virginity, were to be displayed to the assembled crowd, a stark white cloth stained crimson, held aloft like a banner of triumph. If no blood appeared, the consequences were dire. Margaret could be returned to her family in disgrace, branded a liar, or even killed for fraud. The pressure was crushing, her heart sinking at the thought of failure. Some brides, her mother had whispered, pricked their fingers or hid chicken blood to fake the evidence, a desperate act to preserve their honor. The crowd outside waited, their shouts growing louder, their expectation a weight that pressed against her chest. The sheets were not just a symbol but a legal necessity, proof that the marriage was legitimate, the contract fulfilled. Margaret's fear was a cold blade, her body trembling as she faced the moment that would define her worth in the eyes of her community. The legal system reinforced this scrutiny, with church courts probing the details of wedding nights, questioning couples and inspecting bodies for signs of penetration. Neighbors testified to what they heard through the walls, their words carrying the weight of law. The public nature of the ritual was suffocating. Margaret's every move watched, her cries a performance for an audience that cared nothing for her heart. The village was a small, tight-knit community where gossip spread like wildfire, and a woman's reputation could be ruined by a single misstep. Margaret's fear was not just of the act but of the aftermath, the eyes that would judge her, the tongues that would whisper of her failure. The sheets, the blood, the crowd, all were part of a system that saw her body as property, her virginity a commodity to be proven and displayed. Her heart ached with the weight of it, her soul yearning for a privacy she could never claim. The medieval world was haunted by fears of the supernatural, with demons like succubi and incubi believed to seduce humans, stealing their essence through illicit acts. Nightmares and sleep paralysis were blamed on these creatures, their attacks seen as demonic assaults. Margaret's skin prickled at the thought, her nights filled with dread of unseen forces lurking in the dark. The Church prescribed exorcisms and purifications, but suspected victims often faced burning as witches, their fates sealed by fear and superstition. Theologians developed elaborate theories about demons, claiming they could collect semen in female form and impregnate women in male form, a belief that explained mysterious pregnancies or sexual dreams. Margaret's fear was not just of the physical but of the spiritual, her soul at risk in a world where every desire could be a demonic trap. The Church's teachings painted sexuality as a battlefield where pleasure was a sin and demons waited to exploit weakness. Her heart raced at the thought of waking paralyzed, a weight on her chest, the Church's warnings ringing in her ears. Secular tales, told by traveling minstrels, hinted at a hidden world of forbidden pleasures where couples defied the Church's rule. Poets like Andreas Capellanus, writing in the 12th century, described courtship rituals and sexual techniques that scandalized the pious, suggesting a defiance that thrived in the shadows. These stories, shared in taverns and market squares, were a rebellion against the Church's control, a whisper of freedom in a world of restraint. Margaret's heart stirred at the thought, a mix of fear and longing for a world where desire could be her own. But the risks were ever present, the Church's spies listening, their reports feeding into trials that could end in death. Her fear was a constant companion, her dreams haunted by both demons and the allure of forbidden acts, her soul caught between obedience and rebellion. Menstruation was steeped in terror and superstition, seen as a poison and a mark of Eve's original sin. Women were banished to isolation huts, their blood believed to blight crops or sicken men. Physicians prescribed bloodletting or purging to expel tainted blood, treatments that often weakened or killed. Margaret's mother had taught her to hide her cycle, to manage it with secret remedies passed down through generations, away from the prying eyes of priests and physicians. The Church taught that menstruation was a punishment, a monthly reminder of feminine shame, and Margaret's heart sank at the thought of her body betraying her. The lack of understanding created bizarre practices, with women forced to endure painful treatments or isolation, their lives governed by fear of discovery. The village women shared their knowledge in whispers, their remedies a quiet rebellion against a system that saw them as cursed. Margaret's fear was a constant weight, her body a source of both shame and danger, her every cycle a battle against a world that sought to control her. The medieval world was one of surveillance, with the church and community watching for signs of deviance. Confession became a tool for probing intimate details, priests questioning women about their cycles and desires, their words feeding into a system of control. The rise of the Inquisition in the 13th century intensified this scrutiny, with informants reporting on their neighbors' lives. Margaret's heart raced at the thought of being watched, her every move a potential sin. The legal system reflected these anxieties, treating rape as a crime against property, not person, and granting husbands the right to punish adulterous wives with death. The courtly love tradition, with its poetic adoration of women, was a stark contrast to this reality, a spiritual ideal that offered no practical freedom. Margaret's soul yearned for a world where her body was her own, but the weight of tradition, fear, and surveillance held her fast, her life a delicate balance between survival and submission.